yo sé que no es fuerza que le den de comer a uno, ¿verdad? No es fuerza. Y la verdad, pues la comida que están dando aquí, fatal. Miren, bueno, miren lo que están dando. Miren, puros frijoles molidos como para que fuera, como que estuvieran dando de comer a los chanchos.
A los chanchos.
What does that word mean, by the way? I don't know what chanchos mean.
Chancho marrano.
Is that what it means?
Yeah, a los marranos. And in Colombia, what it's funny because I grew up in a place where my neighbor had chanchos, and it was a small city, but they had chanchos, and what they used to do is leftovers. They used to collect the leftovers from around the neighborhood and feed them to the chanchos, and we called that what was the name of that? And I just had the word. But yeah, it was just basically leftovers. It was, geez, I need to look it up, the word, because not aguamasa, it is, there was a specific word that was just kind of leftover food that you feed to los cerdos.
Yeah, yeah, I don't remember what we called that. I know that I grew up in Mexico too, so they would send me to give them the leftovers, and they love that stuff. By the way, like pigs
Yeah.
love leftovers because it's better than anything that they're gonna find on their own, even if it's just for us, it's leftovers. But anyway, this is hilarious though. This is I don't know like I was looking at the beans and they look delicious to me. So that's just my personal take. And I look at this guy over here. I don't think he complained because he looks like he's about to take a nap.
Yeah. He's satisfied.
Yeah,
He has a good time,
but
but yeah, but go ahead.
well, I was gonna say that. So, but this does beg the question, right? And I want to believe as much as I like. I'm trying really hard to believe that everyone in that caravan is a legitimate refugee. But this does beg the question: if you're fleeing your country because you're in grave danger, in danger, such danger that you're risking death if you stay there, if you leave, wouldn't the mindset be slightly different that you're so thankful that you got a chance to leave, that not only are you thankful that Mexico is make accommodating you to a certain extent and even feeding you. It doesn't seem to me like a person that's truly fleeing from those conditions would say something like this. And I think we were talking about this in our last conversation as well. Um, that goes in line also with Mexico offering these refugees political asylum in Mexico, and that they would stay there, that they wouldn't risk. I don't know. It's hard, right? Obviously, I'm not in that situation, but what do you make of that? What does that tell you about the conditions in Honduras? The fact that you have people like her that are. It seems like she's a little bit unaware of her actual situation. Like on the one hand, is she a refugee, but she
Yeah.
still wants to maintain uh, like this what is it? Her reality it's not in line with the what she would want us to believe about her, because it seems like she has unreasonable expectations as to, or just in general unreasonable expectations. Why would you expect to receive good quality food if, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but isn't that setting the bar too high? If you're fleeing from somewhere where you're in fear of death, aren't you gonna
Hmm.
set the bar really low where your goal is gonna be? I just need to get the hell out of here. And if I
Yeah.
get the hell out of here, then that's good enough. And anything else after that, it's all gravy. But maybe I'm thinking about it incorrectly. What do you think?
No, yeah. So I see your point, but I also think you got to put this comment into context, right? So I agree with you that first of all, it is a desperate situation, but it's also not desperate to the point that you're just gonna be willing to eat, insects or things like that, right? So obviously, if it was to the point of desperation, um, to that point that you just survival mode, then you understand that okay, you eat whatever is in ahead of you. But I guess from my perspective, is like one, like why do we need to make people, in this case these refugees, go through that pain and through that experience in order to believe that they're fighting from a legitimate or fleeing from a legitimate concern, right? So yes, it may not be like, and just to pose the picture of starving kids in Africa that sometimes we used to see in the 90s and in other times. In this case, you have somebody who, who looks like she's had a relatively healthy diet back in her country. But also the other point is that, this is after walking 3,000 miles, uh, having to deal with the conditions of the journey, having her two daughters with her, all these things, right? So this is a moment of vulnerability, of just her being, you know what, like I can't believe we're just getting this. This is not enough for me. And in some ways, not immediately judging her for this comment in the same way that we shouldn't judge others, like your mom, for having an initial reaction like, oh my God, that's so ungrateful. Like, yes, maybe that comes out of cross as an ungrateful gesture, but at the same time, it's like it's based. There's so much context around it, right? There's frustration, there is fatigue that settled in, and all these conflicting emotions that where she's just expressing her frustration for her situation.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but um, maybe something that my mom said also makes sense here in terms of what's painting her reality, which is she, she is plugged in, like on the ground, at the ground level. She's plugged in with people that came from Central America, from Honduras. She talks to a lot of them, like some of her friends work in downtown LA here in Costura, and so she's among a lot of people that I'm not exposed to these people, but my mom thinks that um, she's convinced that all of the Hondureños that are here, that they came here, that all they had to do was get to the border and then ask for asylum, and that they were getting in. That's what she's saying. And I was trying to tell her, like, no, that doesn't make any sense. You can't just come to the border just because you're from someplace in Central America and say that you're a refugee and you want political asylum. Like, it doesn't work that way. But she thinks that anybody that comes, like from I think especially from Honduras, and she was telling me, because all of the people that I know, that's how their kids got here, she says. And that point of view, by the way, is very similar to what I hear from right-wing conservatives when they're saying that the borders are open, that they're porous, and anybody can come in from Central America.
Yeah.
But when I started asking, I said, "Look, Mom, it doesn't make any sense. That's not how the immigration system works in the USA. If these people got in here, then that means that you're just talking to the people that had a legitimate reason, because there's interviewers that are going to interview each case, and you're going to have to provide evidence to prove, like, let's say that you're fleeing from gang violence because gangs were threatening to kill you or kidnap you or whatever. You have to show some type of evidence so that it can make your case believable. And then there's an interviewer that's interviewing you that's going to decide whether or not that's credible, and that's how they let you in. And I told her, you're probably just talking to the people that got in, because it's impossible to believe. For me, it's inconceivable to believe that that's the case. That's not how it works. So I told her, but the fact that she believes that is actually very telling, because what I'm trying to get at is that if my mom believes this stuff, then that means that the people in Honduras probably believe similar stories. And then that would mean that someone like Lady Frijol, if she bought into that narrative, because even my mom says that someone was telling them that all they had to do was get to Tijuana and that everything would be taken care of for them. And then from there, they would just have to present themselves at the border, and then, like, maybe they could get in. If Lady Frijol is believing that same narrative, as even if it's incorrect, because that definitely, if my mom believes it, then it's not too far-fetched to believe that people in Honduras will believe something very similar. So if she believes that, then she's already coming with an expectation, right? And maybe it's that expectation that when she's coming in, that, hey, everything in Tijuana is going to be taken care of you, and when you get to the border, it's going to be straightforward to cross. if she believes that, then this reaction here makes sense, because she's saying like, hey, what the hell is this? Frijoles?
Yeah.
Like, come on, guys. Like, I'm coming here with higher expectations modestly higher expectations, right? I'm sure she knows that she is walking across Mexico. So that in itself is an ordeal, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But I have I'm trying to understand why she's making this comment. I'm not trying to judge her. I'm trying to understand where she's coming from. And obviously she's one of many, right? So she's the outlier. She may just be like an ungrateful person. That doesn't mean that all of the other ones are like that. It might just be her, but it's just, I'm trying to make sense of why she would say that.
Yeah, no, and to your point, I think that it wasn't in this particular video, but I know in some of the coverage that I seen of the caravan, I think there was an instance where there were, once people got to Tijuana and once they were dealing with both the situation and the camps, and I think it was shortly after that incident at the border with the tear gas, that there were people who said, you know what, I'm just going to go back to Honduras because this is not what I imagined or had pictured. So I think that there was, to your point of misinformation, or misunderstanding of what that process was going to be like. I think some of the migrants and some of the people were maybe under the assumption that they were going to be able to just walk to the border, say, hey, I'm dealing with this back home, give me asylum, and that process was going to be fairly easy. So to your point, I think it might be that maybe because they heard it from somebody who was able to make it to the United States, where that was actually the case, or maybe it's just kind of like this sometimes, how particularly in places when you don't have a lot of education or you have people who are able to control the narrative in a strong way, we're able to say, oh, don't worry, you just get to the border and the Americans will take care of you. And I think somehow they believe that, right? In some ways, that's been part of the story for immigrants. So like the concept that money grows on trees here in the United States, and that concept sounds like it's unreal, right? It's almost like magical realism. Like, how can money grow on trees? But the bottom line is it kind of represents the fact that, once you get here, yes, you have more opportunities to better yourself because you hopefully have access to a job, and you'll be struggling hard, but it won't be as hard and as difficult as it was back home. So I think there probably along the way there was some information that this lady heard that led her to think that the experience was going to be a little different, a little easier. And again, like sometimes that's something that just happens naturally.
Yeah, that is definitely a phenomenon. I agree with you. And for me, it was similar when I was still growing up in Mexico. You would hear all these stories about people in the U.S. being so wealthy that they would throw away things that we would consider highly functional, like toys, bikes, just because they had a minor scratch, or maybe because they couldn't fix like a small detail, they would just toss it. And to us that sounded like, oh my God, like there's so much wealth over there that they're just throwing away stuff that we would be happy to have. And maybe there's just a very small segment of the population that does that, but that's not true for the general population. And I think the phenomena might be that those stories or those mischaracterizations may come from the people from those communities themselves. So in my case in Mexico, those stories may have been disseminated across my town by the same people from my town that had come to the U.S. And then usually people have they have a tendency to try to paint things in a way that makes them look better. So if people from my town came to the U.S. and they were working really hard and they were struggling, they wouldn't go back and say that. They would go back and say, oh, yeah, it's great. We're doing great. Things are like that. Because I think people have a natural habit of portraying things a little bit better than they really are, just because it makes them feel good, right? To know that, hey, I'm doing well. And might be a similar phenomena here where, like, even the Hondureños that came, they may portray it in a way that's not entirely accurate, that makes it seem like the process is a lot easier than it really is.
Yeah. And what's interesting is just thinking of that phenomenon and sort of applies to your mom, right? Because your mom was the one that saw this information first, this video, and to your point, she also knows Hondureños and other Central Americans, but she saw this video, and I guess what's fascinating now is that technology, videos, the internet is helping accelerate that phenomenon and also make it even more impersonal, right? Because you see in a video or you get in a comment from someone whom you may know, may not know. So it's not like you have a context to judge whether or not the person is credible, right? Because if you have a friend who always exaggerates the truth, you're like, oh yeah, that's just Juanito. He likes to exaggerate things. But as technology continues to become a more important part of our life, and also as a lot of us may not have the digital literacy or may be easily persuaded by what we see, right? And we don't challenge, we don't think critically about what we're watching. It can lead to that phenomenon accelerated, and I think is what has opened the door for now the whole concern about uh, have people been able to manipulate our groupthink through video, through social media, and have them been able to manipulate us by tapping into those very um, things that we're passionate about, and by just like showing us the sensationalist things that we oppose, or helping us get to that position of like, yeah, like that's not right, and this is something that I don't agree, and that this sentiment, this image, this narrative is informing what I think and how I feel about what I'm
Well,
witnessing.
something similar to Facebook, where we put a very highly curated representation of
Yeah.
ourselves because we only want to show the good stuff. We never show the struggles. Similar
Hmm.
in similar in YouTube, where this video, I don't know, it's hard to take this video out of context because it's her own words. Obviously, we don't know much more about her life, but I do know that people started like, I don't know if it's doxing is the right term here, but they definitely went into her background and exposed a lot of her social media life, because there's a
Yeah.
ton of videos that are showing her all the things that she would post on Facebook to try to reaffirm the bias that says like, look, this woman wasn't, like, it seems like she had it pretty good in Honduras, like, and then, but again, that but when I saw that, I was like, well, that doesn't really mean anything, even because she could have had it pretty good in Honduras. It still doesn't mean that she's not a refugee, because her
No.
things could have taken a drastic turn in the last few weeks or year of her life, because this is a whole life that people are criticizing now. So yeah, so maybe she was doing well in Honduras, maybe, because what they're doing now is like type of like a character assassination with
Yeah, I was gonna say
by
that.
sharing those Facebook posts of her trying to say, look at her, se creía, she thought of herself as like wealthy, she was a show off, she thought that she was. I was like, okay, yeah, so what? That's just like her personality. That has nothing to do with the fact that she is looking for refugee status in the U.S. It's two separate things, but a lot of the times people don't separate the two. Um, why don't we listen to a little bit more of what she had to say? And I think she, after this whole thing went viral and she started getting the criticisms and even threats. My mom said death threats as well, but I haven't seen any, but maybe there were. But she said that she received all kinds of like negative animosity against her. And then she
Hmm.
issued an apology. So we'll listen to this and then the apology.
Pues ni modo, hay que comerse esa comida porque si no, nos morimos del hambre. Porque todo el mundo lo ha visto en las redes sociales, incluso mi familia, yo me di cuenta ayer y me estaban también por WhatsApp mandándome todo eso. Y aquí no me dice un primo mío, y aquí no comía frijoles, me decía, ¿ya qué pasó? Y yo le expliqué a mi primo y esto y esto. Pero yo sinceramente yo les pido perdón por lo que dije y humildemente he creado a mis hijos cuando no he tenido, y si he tenido tortilla yo les he dado a mis hijos. Mi hijo el mayor a veces se quita el pan para darme a mí, darme a mí, a mis hijos, salir de mi país para operar a mi nena. Yo lo único, operar a mi nena, si me quieren mandar para mi país, yo me voy, pero yo sé que ella va a operar. Eso es lo que quiero y yo les pido perdón de todo corazón.
So that's really interesting. I mean, part of the it's comical, right? The whole
Yeah.
episode is comical in itself. But did you listen to what she said at the end about her daughter?
Yeah.
She said that it sounded to me like she said her motivation for trying to come over is for the operation for her daughter.
Yeah, I think one of her daughters is sordo muda or has some sort of medical condition. Though I think there was another video that I saw by DW, which I think is a Spanish news media that actually did the first interview, as you can see from the DW and the microphone
Right.
in the original video. I think they did a more extensive piece saying that, yeah, one of the reasons that she decided to make the trip was to try to get one of her daughters a medical treatment that she needed.
But then she said in this video, and when she issued her apology, she said that after they do that, if they do that operation, then they can send her back. She said, I don't care. Which, I mean, that's admirable, right? And I don't have any criticism of that. But the law that she's trying to use to get into the U.S., which is the asylum law, it wouldn't cover that case. Like, I think that there have been extraordinary circumstances where sick kids in other countries maybe come to the U.S. to receive a special type of medical treatment. I don't know what that process is like, what the pipeline is, how do you apply, and so forth. But I don't think that's the political asylum pipeline. So, go ahead.
No, it isn't. But I don't know if you saw, and probably you didn't because you're not watching Univision Noticias. But there was actually last weekend, there was a story about this young father who did the walk with his daughter who had cerebral palsy, and he carried her and walked with her in a stroller, and I think she's probably like 10 or 11, so she's getting there. But once he got to the border, I think one of the nonprofits organizations in San Diego had been monitoring the case, and they were able to facilitate the more prompt access of him, so he could be in the country, in the United States, and for his daughter to start getting treatment. So that's the thing. And I think that process is analogous to what's happening with the broken immigration system that we have, right? Like, yes, there's a process in place, but it's a process in place that is not realistic, and that's not working the way that it should be. And then the other piece is that, unfortunately, it sucks that there's so much suffering, so much disease in the rest of the world, but the U.S. cannot do it all on its own, right? And there needs to be a way for other countries, for Latin American countries themselves, to be able to develop the health infrastructure and all of those things that allow them to care for their people. So I think that's it's a multi-layer, multifaceted problem, and unfortunately, sometimes you just kind of see this snippets of what happens, and you don't see what goes into the creation of all of this story.
No, I mean,
human suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying regarding the need to provide a better way to try to help out these kids in these situations. But are you telling me though that the immigration system in the United States will let you into the United States if you show up at the border with a kid that needs some type of medical assistance?
I don't know. I don't know if there's a particular medical exception, but I think if the case is significant, I think what may happen is that you have to have a hospital or another organization who says, we need to bring this person in for treatment, and this is the only place where they can have it, or they don't have the resources to treat it back home.
That makes
it's almost like you need to have a sponsor, right?
Right, but that makes sense. But how does that translate then to somebody getting to stay in the U.S. permanently? Because in that case, wouldn't it be a situation where, okay, sure, you come to the U.S. and you can receive the treatment, and then you can go back, maybe even follow-up treatment, but then you have to go back to the country? right? So I don't. So obviously, I have to go back and read it, but at least the system of political asylum is very clear in that it looks at refugees that are fleeing their country for specific reasons, and I don't think that falls under that. So you're right that there might be another clause in there, but I haven't heard of it. And I guess the reason why I'm asking is because I think this is the type of thing that makes a lot of right wing conservatives think that the borders are open. If they hear things like you show up at the border and your kid's sick, then they'll let you in. Um, Obviously, like I feel like yeah, they should help them. I'm just trying to understand the technicalities of the law and what the law says. Because if the law right now it's saying that yeah, if you show up at the border and you have a case in it, if it's not just a political asylum case because you're fleeing violence, then that means that there's a whole bunch of other reasons that we don't know. And maybe then my mom's assertion of what she was saying, maybe there's some truth to what she was saying. That if you show up at the border, then it's easy for you to get in, assuming that you have some type of reason.
Yeah. And I think there might be humanitarian reasons why people may be let in, but I think just for a moment to think about how difficult it is for the people enforcing this law, right? So I know earlier in the conversation we talked about that there's actually somebody who's going to be interviewing this person, this woman, or any refugee, and they're going to have to make an assessment, right? And in some ways, it's almost like how do you decide which case is more critical, more important, and deserves admission to the United States. So like for my perspective, for me, just thinking how difficult it is to, one, as a person who represents the system, to be able to assess that, and then B, how from the law, like policy, and you need to have policy in order to have a system, right? Some fairness to say, okay, we're treating everybody by this criteria, and if you meet these things, then you follow this process. But obviously, there's so many exceptions, so many complications, so many things that need to be taken into consideration that could impact how your case is looked at and analyzed, and even just being able to present that case is on itself like a big accomplishment, right? Just getting to fill in the application or go to the consulate back in your home country to be able to get that opportunity to just present your case is such such a big step. And then whether or not the case is accepted, obviously that's another thing.
So I pulled up the page on the asylum from USCIS, and so these are the main sections, right? So you're fleeing because if you stay behind, you'll suffer persecution from race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. So I'm not saying that. I actually feel that if the U.S. enacted some type of laws that said, yeah, if you have a medical need for your child, you can come in and receive it, I think that's great. I think if it would work that way, I would be all for it. Obviously, there's the issue of like who's paying for that and all of those things. So the conversations obviously could get messy and so forth. But I'm just trying to understand what the actual law says. So I don't. If I'm looking at these cases where the man with the little girl that you said that she had, what's the condition? Cerebral palsy. Yeah, mm-hmm. And then in this case, Lady Frijol, who's saying that her her daughter is deaf and she just wants the operation. I think in cases like these, I don't think they would be able to get into the U.S. just based on that alone. They have to have one of these other situations. I think what may be happening is that they are coming from Honduras, and when they do get to the border, when they do have their trial, the backdrop, the foundation of their case may be we are fleeing from Honduras because of these reasons, gang violence and so forth, right? But in addition to that, I have my son that needs this operation. So that may be used as an additional way to try to petition for themselves to get the
Yeah.
asylum. But I don't think you can just show up and say I need to get to the U.S. because my daughter needs an operation.
I wonder what that humanitarian parole category above refugee and asylum is. You see how it was right there on the previous page? You had it.
Oh, right here?
Right above it says humanitarian parole. I'm just wondering if they have any. Oh, it sounds like it's more specific to the minors, Cuban reunification, Filipino. But these seem to be exceptions that have been done into law. I guess you also have special circumstances, special situations as well. So,
Recreation would apply under the special program such as the Haiti Foundation, the Cuban. Yeah, so these are exceptions to an actual crisis in another country, right? So that's the humanitarian cause. I'm telling you. So when I hear stuff like when my mom was saying that just everybody in her job, they just got in because they show up at the border, I'm like, no, that doesn't make any sense. That sounds too good to be true. Things don't work that way. And the same thing with what I'm hearing and Lady Frijol saying that she gets to the border, that she's gonna say that her daughter needs an operation. That's why she wants to come over, and afterwards they can send her back. That doesn't make any sense. And if she says that they can send her back, then that means that she's not really fleeing from any persecution or maybe she is, but at that point she doesn't care because she's going to be happy that her daughter received the operation. I think, like I said, I think the foundation of their case is still that they're fleeing and that they're refugees, and then just having the sick child may be something that they can use to strengthen their case. And I don't know to what extent that would do it. Obviously, there's some like immigration lawyers, there's some other people, and I can probably I'll spend more time looking into this, but just I didn't realize that we were gonna get into like this particular, like we were gonna go in this direction for it. But I'm sure there's a lot of information on that. But just from what I know, just on the political asylum, that it wouldn't cover that.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding too. That it has to be a pretty those reasons outlined before in terms of racial, political. But for me, it's interesting because obviously the political persecution, and to your earlier point, like how do you present evidence, right? So, and I know there was of the few cases. Go ahead.
Sorry, my mom was telling me that people would use like newspaper clippings. Like, let's say that you're coming from a small town in Honduras that's been ravaged by violence, and then the gangs have taken over. And if you stay behind, they're going to take your kid and induct them into the gang and so forth, right? If that's your case, and if you can bring newspaper clippings that say that police were in a shootout with gangs and so many police officers died and so forth, I think that's the type of stuff that strengthens your case to say, look, it's unsafe for me to go back home. Even though they're not fleeing from a government entity, they're fleeing from violence that has gotten out of control because it's the gangs.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense, but just the concept of you as a person documenting those things and being able to not only document it to a level that proves your case, but then to save that documentation and bring it with you and the journey. And people have done it, but just thinking of the high bar that is placed on this, right? And a lot of these people, yes, they're affected by these situations, but they probably cannot specifically say my family was targeted or I was targeted. They may be able to say I live in this community and this is what's happening, but unless you have had somebody in your family killed or actually received threats, or maybe you have some WhatsApp messages from people who are trying to extort money from you, that's going to be, it's pretty difficult to prove.
Well, right. Well, and that's going to go into the credibility of the case. And in the cases that you're talking about where they don't have this type of proof, I think the people just get sent back. They don't let them get into the U.S. And that's what I was telling my mom. I said, look, there's a lot of people that for every person that comes in that you've probably been in contact with, they probably rejected a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
Because there's interviewers, there's people that are specifically paid to be to interview refugees, and they have to make a determination to even if there's only like some evidence, they still have to listen to the story, and they have to come to an assessment to figure out if the story that they're hearing seems like it could be truthful, and then they try to study the person to see if this person is someone that is believable. So that all of that goes into it. I think even if you have, like, let's say you're fleeing gang violence and you say that the gangs attacked you because you wouldn't join and they stabbed you or they shot at you, well, you have those physical wounds that you can use to show, and like all that goes into it. So it's very, like I said, it's a whole process, and just getting to the border and getting picked up by immigration does not mean automatic entry, because if it did, you know what would happen if it did mean automatic entry? You know what people would do? Like, Mexicans would just figure out a way to buy fake Honduran citizenship and then try to come as Hondurans, right? So a whole bunch of people would just try to game the system.
Yeah, and I think you sort of point out to the fear of the extreme right. Like, that's their fear. Like, oh, if we let these refugees come in, the rest of Latin America or other countries, more people are going to come, and the opposite is true too. Like, as people see stories like, oh yeah, people just showed up at the border and they were let in, then let's just go to the border. So you can kind of see how both sides of this divide have come to their stances, right? And there may be like, it sucks that people are suffering in Latin America. It sucks that this is happening, but we cannot open our borders, or we cannot accept these folks, because then that's going to lead to more people thinking that they can be here, and then our system is going to be overwhelmed, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. No, it's so true that's why I think it's really important for people to try to question everything, not just believe everything at face value, and try to get different sources, and try to, if it sounds a little ludicrous or too good to be true, then it probably is. It's probably a little bit more complex than that, and a lot of the times it's just easier to believe the extreme side of it, like the extreme, like, again, yeah, like you pointed out, like people thinking that, hey, just anyone that goes through the border can get in. It's absolutely not the case. But if they think like that, and then it just drives their paranoia. I don't know. Look, I don't know where I land on the whole immigration debate. I'm speaking about it from a whole point of privilege. Obviously, if I was in that situation, I probably feel like I would have a good reason. Like, let's say you're Central American, you're Honduran. Let's say that your country has been through wars in the 80s that were primarily as a result of outside interference, the U.S. meddling in Honduras, essentially destroying it. And then you have some awareness that you don't have an independent political system, that your government can't just try to do whatever it thinks it's good for the people, because external forces like the United States is going to go in there if it doesn't favor U.S. corporations, right? So in a sense, you've been victimized your whole life by this external entity. You feel indignation. You feel like, well, screw them. Like, here I am suffering. I'm going to go over and I'm going to cross that border illegally, and I'm going to jump into the United States and get some of the benefits that they're extracting from my country and from other countries. That could be some of the point of view of some of the people that are coming over. It's hard to say, because and I mean, I think Americans should also recognize the fact that, I mean, I think we talked about this in our last conversation. A lot of them are saying, well, why don't these people stay back in their countries back home and rise up against their government? And I'm like, well, because they don't have an independent government. And if they do rise up against their government, guess what? Let's say they install a leader that's more for the people, that wants to pass social policies that will help the people, and that is going to kick out, like, maybe American corporations that are screwing over people. Guess what the U.S. government's going to do? They're going to try to instigate a coup and overthrow that leader. So maybe if the Americans that want to criticize the Central Americans for not standing up to their government, maybe the Americans here should also do something about their government meddling in the affairs of Central Americans, if they don't want to see a lot of people coming through the borders, because otherwise you're not going to solve that problem. People are just going to come in, because when people get desperate enough and they lose, like, certain fears, then they're willing to go to a lot of lengths to try to provide a better life for themselves and for their kids.
Very true.
That was my little rant. Sorry.
It's fine. You can do those every once in a while.
Yeah. So where do we land on Lady Frijol?
Lady Frijol. I think for me it's just um, an interesting case study of of the impact of technology, in this case video, and in the sort of the phenomenon of of being able to use information on the internet to support your existing argument. And I think, and I don't know if you would be consider this, but maybe one of the things that you should, the other video that you should play is the one where they do the remix. So
Oh,
this is
okay.
kind of like where they take a sad situation on all accounts, but then somebody decided to do a cumbia
Well,
remix
yeah, at that
to
point,
the situation, which it kind of
yeah,
also is kind of like, bringing levity to this whole,
yeah. Well, once it's out on the internet, it becomes parody, and the parody
yeah.
becomes a parody of itself, and so yeah, it's out there. People are gonna get really creative with it. Um, well, in wrapping it up, I think she should have just eaten the frijoles. They look pretty good to me.
They look good.
All right, we'll wrap it up. Hey, thanks for the talk. We'll pick up next time on another topic.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, bye.